Cloister. Prologue. In the Duchy of Bourgogne in the year 1142, the largest church in Christendom stood on a hill above the tiny village of Cluny. That church, with its towering belfry, Corinthian columns, and massive rectangular pilasters, defined the pulse of the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, a large walled complex, itself the center of a vast monastic empire, counting 10,000 monks and nuns in foundations spread across the continent from the Mediterranean to the British Isles. The sharply pointed Cluny belfry was visible for miles around and had served across the last phase of a long journey as the locating focal point for a small band of horsemen that approached now, making its way up the final slope toward the monastery gate. The palfrey, on which a heavily cloaked rider sat, as it slowly ascended the hill, was a lighter weight horse, and its unsteady gait suggested what a distance it had come. Trailing behind were 4 other ridden horses and a hitched pair pulling a covered cart. The wind was howling from the valley spread below, and the sun was low on the distant ridge. The stout wooden gate banged open. The porter rushed out, going to the first horse to take its headstall and stirrup. In a bustle of activity, others of the minor orders followed from within the monastic enclosure, the almoner, oblates, and lay brothers. A knot of black robes, they surrounded the riders and the cart. With the porter's help, the first rider dismounted, throwing aside the covering woolen mantle and being seen only then for the religious woman she was. The porter bowed, showing his tonsure, muttering, "My lady." 2 others in the party were religious sisters, clothed like the first in a long gray belted tunic, scapular white coif, and veil. Except that the fabric was the gray of rough, undyed wool, the garb was the habit of the Benedictine order. They were nuns. The party's 6 accompanying men were the horsemaster, the marshal, 2 armed henchmen, and 2 stewards. As the first nun, walking erect and at an authoritative clip, led the way through the gate, the receiving monks bowed, even while stealing glances at her sharply concentrated face. With whispers they had spoken of this arrival, although this woman of slight stature and medium height did not match the measure of the songs sung in her name. She was the Abbess Héloïse, Mother Superior of the Abbey of the Paraclete, a ranking convent several days' journey by river and rough trail to the north. In those whispers, they had spoken of what she would be coming for. There would be further songs. The porter had been instructed to show her at once into the main cloister garden, to which women were ordinarily forbidden entrance. But the instruction had come from the abbot primate himself. At this time of year, The garden was still bare of fruit and berries, but twigs shone with the fresh scales of buds and shoots. The waters of the central fountain, drawing on the stream that ran below the monastic kitchens and toilet block, had quickened in recent weeks, but would not splash again until the coming spring rains replenished its flow. The normally bright marble of the arches and pillars of the surrounding arcade was dusky gray now, for the shadows of evening had settled on the place, like loneliness. The Vespers bell would be ringing soon. The porter gestured at a garden bench, but did not wait to see if Mother Héloïse would sit. She watched him hurry away, as relieved to be alone as, after the day's ride, she was to be standing. It was not long before the abbot primate entered, coming from the chapel. Because his cowl was up, his face was shadowed. Across his chest was the leather strap of a pilgrim's satchel, hanging at his side. The unfettered stride with which he crossed to her suggested the depth of feeling that she knew was there. His arms were stretched toward her, but as he drew close, she genuflected a proper obeisance. With her head bowed, she reached for his hand, pulled it to her mouth, and kissed his ring. Grasping her upper arms, he lifted her. He lowered his cowl, unveiling sadness. "Where is he, Most Holy Father?" she asked. The abbot primate turned slightly, gesture enough to indicate the chapter house. The darkened room close at hand, separated from the garden by a large arcaded gate of 3 stout arches, each one upheld by a clutch of fluted pillars. Mother Héloïse peered into the room. Under the interlacing of groined ceiling vaults, the open space was large enough to accommodate the professed members of the monastic family, with each monk sitting at the wall on the stone bench that defined 3 sides of the rectangle. Now the room was vacant, but as her eyes adjusted, she made out the dark form of the catafalque standing in the center. She should have sought the abbot primate's leave to move away from him, but did not. Instead, she simply walked out of the garden, crossing through the arcade to enter the chapter house, going directly to the one for whom she had come. The lids of his eyes were down, but his lips were slightly parted. The lips from which the most precious words had pierced her heart. The lips with which her own had been so sweetly caressed. His lips. She bent to them, touched them lightly with her cheek, and then put her mouth on his. "Oh, Peter." The abbot primate took up a place behind her. To her back, he said quietly, "When I sent for you, I assumed he would still be alive at your arrival. I am sorry." He waited. When finally she turned to him, she said, "They condemned him because of me." Her voice was shot through with feeling, a mix of grief and anger. "Because I refused to renounce my love, because he remained mine through all calamity. I will publish his virtues across all the world to punish the age that has not valued him." "It is true, Mother. They hated him for what he had in you. But he opposed them in their vain repudiations of God's mercy. By the end, he was an exemplar of mercy, That is what he had from you. Mercy. Against all charges leveled at you, the measure of your love was mercy, not licentiousness. He disowned our promiscuity, she said. I did not. He did what was necessary to keep his authority, the abbot replied, as you yourself wanted. You flogged him with your writing to re-enter the fray, and he did. She said, Peter Abelard was an apostle of Caritas, and yet he was damned. The abbot said, the excommunication will be lifted. I will make it happen. Then the gates of heaven will be open to him. We will be authorized to inter him here in sacred ground, and we will do that here at Cluny. No, I will have him at the Paraclete. I will have him with me. It's why I've come. Any ground that receives this man will be sacred. The abbot primate began to object, but she raised her hand again, stopping him. He stared at her. She did not blink. Finally, he lowered his eyes. One of the most powerful men in Christendom, yet he yielded to this woman. I will depart with him tomorrow at first light, she said. I will need fresh horses. He will be mine at last. After a long silence, the abbot pulled back the flap of his leather satchel, and he withdrew a sheaf of beribboned vellum sheets. He said, Peter asked me to return these to you. Mother Héloïse received the bundle solemnly, knowing at once what it was. Her letters. All that she had written to him. And then the abbot produced another pair of bundles. He said, these also. His credo, a last explanation of himself. Solemnly the abbot handed her the sheaf. And the other. He held the second, hesitating. An unfinished treatise, what he called Dialogue with the Jew. I alone have read it. Guard these words. Peter was never guarded with words, she said. She received the pages, but she was bristling. Guard these words, Mother. Clairvaux's dark angels are everywhere, spies, even here at Cluny. He joined with me in the petition to Rome only because he, Clairvaux, the enemy, thinks he has heard the last from Peter Abelard. This treatise must not be published. They condemned him once because of the Jews. They will again. Jews are being attacked, murdered, she said. If Peter wrote of Jews now, despite the council's damnamus, it was to defend our Lord's own cousins, for was Jesus Christ not a Jew? Mother, there are reports of Jews slaughtering Christian children to get their blood. That is nonsense. Perhaps, but Jews murdered their own children in Mainz, that is certain. Yes, she said, to prevent their being kidnapped by the cross-bearers and forcibly baptized. That was not murder, it was martyrdom. Be careful of that, Mother. These are fires from which we must now protect Peter Abelard's name. Jews be damned. The battle now is for Peter's eternal salvation. We must have the anathema avoided. Guard those words if you want the papal rescript granted. Father Abbot took hold of her forearm fiercely. For the sake of his eternal soul, Mother, guard those words. She clung to the pages. Despite the hot rush of what she felt, she nodded. a promise. (1950), New York, Chapter 1. Father Michael Kavanagh wandered the park for most of an hour and was in the thickly wooded well of a glen when it began to rain. He wasn't sure which way was out. The path ahead ascended steeply, and he took it, cursing himself for not having worn a hat. At first the rain was light, but it began to come down sharply, and he picked up the pace, moving steadily uphill. Because the path was serpentine, the foliage overgrown and the downpour heavy, he could not see ahead, and it surprised him when, as he was taking a last turn, the huge museum building appeared above, looming like a granite butte. He headed for it. An American Catholic should have loved that place. The museum took the form of a medieval monastery, with elements plucked from the rubble of a long-lost Europe and lovingly restored on a pinnacle overlooking the Hudson River. But at that point, few Catholics did. The Cloisters housed the Metropolitan Art Museum's masterpiece collections of tapestries, altarpieces, frescoes, sculpted figures, fountains, and stained glass windows, all dating to between the 12th and 15th centuries. But the Cloisters was not a true monastery, or even an authentic imitation. It was a Rockefeller-funded fantasy structure, a mishmash of belfries, architectural fragments, aged pillars, arched doorways, stairways, arcades, all tastefully reassembled to evoke the high romance of Gothic revival that had so quickened the patrician imagination of the Gilded Age. The inspiration here was not Saint Henry, the patron halo of the childless and the handicapped, but Henry Adams, for whom Chartres' triumph was only aesthetic. In fact, the museum was a stunning monument to the artistic achievement of Catholic high culture. But Kavanagh's parishioners knew better than to consider it theirs. What were a bunch of moth-eaten old wall hangings or limestone statues with smashed faces anyway? What counted in monasteries were the monks and nuns and their spiritual works of mercy, men and women on their knees, not gawking at pictures. To the good people of Good Shepherd, the cloister seemed a peculiar, haunted emptiness. And but for the handful of Irish who found employment there as guards or maintenance men, the parish was content to ignore it. Kavanagh rushed into the place for its shelter from the rain. A short walk down a stone corridor, hung with a gruesome crucifix, a penitent Magdalene, and a sorrowful Madonna, led into a large rectangular enclosure organized around a glassed-in courtyard, a classic rendition of the ancient monastic hub. The quadrangle was defined by a long, four-sided arcade that begged to be walked around. At the far opposite end of the colonnade, a small group of people were gathered around a painting too far away to notice or care about the complications of a momentarily thrown middle-aged priest. To his right, through a semicircular arch whose Romanesque sturdiness jarred with the more delicately pointed Gothic-era arches of the arcade proper, was a vacant, unfurnished, low-ceilinged hall with a stone bench running all along three walls. He went in, as if the room had been his destination all along, and he took up a place on the bench as if he had a right to be there. He picked up his breviary and reflexively flipped the ribbon to the appointed page. He began to read the day's psalm as if he were a monk. Cloister, he heard some moments later, from the Latin claustrum, for closed. A voice had come to Kavanagh, but it was some woman's. He did not look up. In French, she continued, we say cloître. In this museum, we have 5 distinct cloisters, hence the plural of the museum's name, the Cloisters. But this one, dating to the 12th century, is the jewel, the one around which all the others are organized, the reason we are here. When Kavanagh raised his eyes, it was to find that instead of along the arcade or at the closed-in quad, the woman was looking directly at him. She was a museum docent, clearly. She was giving instruction to a clutch of ladies whose look was fixed the other way down the aisle of the colonnade along which the docent had been pointing. She had spoken enough so that Kavanagh took in her French accent. There was an aphonic quality to her voice, low-pitched, rough, suggesting a whisper, though she could be readily heard. When their eyes met, they held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then she faced away and resumed. When this cloister was in its monastery, La Chapelle-sur-Loire, in southern Bourgogne, its dimensions were twice this size. The ladies earnestly looked about, taking in the quadrangles, pink marble arches, and supporting columns. Constructed most of 1,000 years ago, the docent took several steps away from the group, letting her long, thin arm carve a graceful arc encompassing the entire scene, an unfeigned gesture of delight. This was the enclosure onto which all of the monastic buildings would have opened, the chapel, refectory, dormitories, kitchen, and chapter house. At this last phrase, she threw a sidelong glance Kavanagh's way, which made him realize the chapter house referred to the room he had settled in. The docent turned, taking a few steps along the arcade. The ladies followed. This cloister, she continued, carefully pronouncing each word, but with her Gallic intonation, formed the center of one of the network of Benedictine foundations attached to the great abbey at Cluny. Her spiel was practiced, but did not seem canned. She simply knew what she was talking about. She had fallen into an unself-conscious pose, letting her fingers rest in a stone crevice, joining a pillar to its sculpted capital, her hand at a level just above her head. She was tall. She was dressed unremarkably in black laced Oxford shoes, a long, dark skirt, and a white blouse whose pointed collars were slightly askew above a formless, fully buttoned cardigan sweater. She wore no jewelry. The slender hand at her hollow cheek emphasized an overall litheness. Her black hair was cut short like a man's, close against her skull. Her clothing hung on her loosely. She was not lithe, he saw now, but extremely thin, as if her body had known malnourishment. A wasting disease in her past, perhaps. Consumption, tuberculosis. The only skin showing was at her hands and face, but it carried the hint of an ashen hue. "If you please," the woman said, moving the group along, "this carving of a double-headed monster," they began to drift away toward a new threshold, which invites the viewer to contemplate as the monks always would have. Her last words carried back to Kavanagh. The great struggle between vice and virtue. Then they were gone. Well, you get the picture. How many people have been to the Cloisters? So you know the place. That central garden is where Héloïse collected Peter Abelard. So the Cloisters says. But why not? It actually could be, which is the point of fiction. What if, as our friend Anne Bernays, Pamela Painter, Truro, they asked in the book they wrote about fiction. I want to thank Galen and Tricia for your welcome. I know it is what an honor it is to be in the tradition of reading here. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. We have a few minutes. I'd be glad to carry on a conversation with you. Is there anything you'd like to say? Yes?
I'm wondering what got you interested in Héloïse and Abelard.
What got me interested in Héloïse and Abelard? Well, as a young man, I knew their story, but only as a passionate love story that went awry. You remember that, so Peter Abelard died in the early 1140s, perhaps 1142 or 1143. You all remember Eleanor of Aquitaine, who you most dramatically encountered when Katharine Hepburn played her in The Lion in Winter as an old woman up against an aged King Richard the Lionhearted, played by Peter O'Toole. But as a young woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine invented the myths associated with courtly love. So she was the queen, first of France, then she was the heir, the princess of Aquitaine became the queen of France and the queen of England in the period of the Second Crusade, went with her husband Louis on the crusades of the Holy Land. But she was the one who commissioned troubadours to sing the great songs of romance. And one of the myths of courtly love, you recall, was unrequited and chaste love. Prince Lancelot and his chaste love for Guinevere. This was the time when the knights were secretly dedicating their tournament to the woman who was unavailable to them, and so on. Well, Eleanor was enthralled with the story of Abelard and Héloïse, and she was the one who saw to the broad publication of their letters, which made the myth of the passionate romance that was thwarted by the church. Because, as you remember the story, Peter Abelard, the greatest teacher in Europe, at the cathedral school in Paris, at Notre Dame, what becomes the University of Paris, the Sorbonne today, Peter Abelard was the inventor of the university in Paris. And he was given the instruction by the canon of the cathedral, the man in charge, to instruct his niece, who had outpaced the instructor nuns in the convent where she had been raised. She was a member of the royal family. And they fell in love, and they had a passionate affair. And when the canon of the cathedral discovered it, he sent his henchmen to attack Peter Abelard, who was castrated, humiliated, shamed, expelled, and effectively banished to a monastery. And Héloïse self-banished herself in response to a monastery, became a nun, and yet that began the most powerful part of their relationship, because even though they were separated, even though they had a child, that was what led to their being discovered. The child was raised by Peter's sister. They exchanged letters over the next 20 years that are a record of passionate love, recrimination, guilt. He's guilty. She is insistent on the beauty and power of their love for each other, including its physical aspects, doesn't regret anything. She's in a way the first feminist. She claims her integrity. She claims her power as a woman. She refuses to yield to his self-hating, self-doubting, self-recrimination. And on the contrary, she challenges him to re-enter the fray that he had left. And he begins to join the debate of the great theological crisis that was unfolding just then, in the time of the Crusades, because that's when sacred violence came into the Christian imagination. God wills it was the slogan of the First Crusade. God was understood as wanting Christians to slay the infidel, including the infidel near at hand, the Jews. Peter Abelard comes to the defense of a different kind of God, rejects this new violent God, and in particular defends the right of Jews to live peacefully as Jews within Christendom. And for that he was condemned as a heretic. When I was a young man, I knew the romance, but I didn't know the powerful witness against the Jew hatred of the Christian tradition. And over the last few decades, I have taken on, for peculiar reasons of my own, the question of Christian anti-Semitism. And when I discovered that Peter Abelard and Héloïse were at the threshold of this decisive choice that the Christian world made against the Jews, I understood that the story could have gone another way if Peter Abelard's view had carried the day. And when I first wrote about that in a book about anti-Semitism 20 years ago. I'm a novelist. I knew, even as I was working on the history, that someday I would return to the subject as a novelist. So Peter Abelard and Héloïse, I do tell that story here, climaxing with his condemnation at the Council of Sin. And that prologue that I just read, coming shortly after that, Peter has died, refers to his having been condemned. They're great figures. And if they had carried the day, as I said, we would live in a different world now. It would be a very different world. Which is why we study history, isn't it? Because if we understand that calamitous events in the past might have gone another way, we can understand that they can go a different way yet. That's the point. And Michael Kavanagh, a young priest in Good Shepherd Parish, who knows nothing about the real reason for Abelard's notoriety, is instructed in that story by the woman whom we've just encountered, the docent at the Cloisters, who was a French woman, this is 1950, who has recently arrived in New York, having been interned with her father in Drancy, the concentration camp on the outskirts of Paris. She's a Jew. Her father, a great Talmudic scholar, Saul Vedette, determined in 1940 and 41, as the news of Vichy is coming down on Jews in France, determined that France needed to know the other story about this great hero of French culture, Peter Abelard, who was remembered as Eleanor of Aquitaine's beau ideal of romantic love. But what about Peter Abelard, the defender of the Jewish people? So Rachel's father takes on the task of bringing that Abelard forward. And of course it gets him killed. Now you don't need to read the novel. Yes, ma'am.
My memory's wonderful, but it's a little short. So I did read the book and Cloisters and loved it. But Bernard, and I was at the St. Bernard.
That's the St. Bernard.
That is the
Bernard,
St.
yes.
Bernard. Does
Yes.
not come off well in the.
No, he's a villain, isn't he?
Yes, he really is.
Yes, and he's a saint.
Yeah.
Guess what?
Yeah.
Guess what?
Yeah, and who was there was another one. That's what I'm forgetting.
Well, Peter the Venerable
Yes.
is the abbot primate of Cluny. Is that the one you're thinking?
I think so, but I just wondered.
People who love Saint Bernard and we're not talking about the dog, although the dog is named for this saint. People who love St. Bernard will not like my novel, because I put it entirely different. St. Bernard was the preacher of the crusade. He was the founder of the Knights Templar, which is a religious order under the laws of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they're the Marine Corps of the Middle Ages. They will go anywhere and kill anybody, as long as they're an infidel. And that's St. Bernard. St. Bernard is part of Eleanor of Aquitaine's romantic love glorification of knighthood. And the fact that the knight gets dubbed with the sword at the altar in a religious ceremony, there's something whacked about this. God wills it. What happened to the Prince of Peace? That's Peter Abelard's question. Bernard is a saint. He was the most powerful man in Christendom at that moment. He had the Pope under his thumb. And he's the one who saw to the condemnation of Peter Abelard.
So that was my question, just that your portrayal of him in the novel is historically very accurate.
It's arguable. History is always an argument. It's an interpretation. There were things about St. Bernard that made him made a saint. I mean, there were virtues, and every person is a mixed bag. But St. Bernard, the fact that St. Bernard won the contest with Peter Abelard is one of the great tragedies, not of Christian history, but of Western history. Because it sacralized violence in the Christian imagination. The just war. God wants us to kill people. And you know, we're only getting out of it now. And we're not getting out of it. I have to say, we're not getting out of it. No, some of us are getting out of it now. I mean, there's a great Christian pushback against this. Did I?
Yes.
Do you want to come back? Maybe you're a fan of St. Bernard.
No, I'm not particularly, but I was just surprised. That was a surprise to me when I read it. The other question I had was, will there be a sequel? I just wondered, will there be another book regarding Rachel and Kavanagh?
Depends on when I die. As of now, I don't imagine it. Did you read the book?
Yes.
Yeah, so it ends. It's a sweet last line, isn't it? Remember what the last line is?
I told you it's short.
Yeah, no. She calls him by name.
Yes, right.
She calls him Michael.
So we can take that where we want.
Exactly. You get to write the sequel. Other comments or questions? Yes.
I just along the lines of what you're speaking about in Father Kavanagh in the book, he talks about his feeling of responsibility for violence that was perpetrated in the past.
A little louder, please.
That he felt responsible, he took personal responsibility for violence that was in God's name. I think that's at least how I took it. A sense of collective responsibility or collective consciousness and collective responsibility for violence that takes place. And I just wondered if you could talk about that.
Well, there's no direct, it's not a mechanistic parallel between Abelard and Héloïse and Father Kavanagh and Rachel Vedette. It's not a direct thing. But one thing the two stories have in common is Héloïse challenged Abelard to change and to take on the moral consequences of what he believed. And that's what Rachel does with Father Kavanagh. He arrives in this moment. He has his own reasons for having kind of restlessness and unease about his life, but he's naive. And he meets her, and she is fierce and unyielding. And every time he says something callow, or that only goes a quarter inch deep, she gives him a look. And it's not a big verbal duel, but she just refuses to meet with him. And It's very painful for him. But it's ultimately so redemptive. It changes him. And he changes his life because of it. And it's not a romance. It's not a romance. Which is, a disappointment to some readers. That isn't the point. It's an encounter over the truth. And it's 1950, and Christians, Catholics in particular, had not at all begun to reckon with what had just happened in Europe. Catholics and Christians in France certainly, but even including in Germany, were embracing the myth that the church had been as much a victim of the Nazi demonizing of the world as Jews were. And there was no reckoning, not for years. And it's still not finished. It's not finished at all. And France is still having trouble reckoning with its complicity in what happened in France. The people who arrested the Jews in Paris were not Germans. The guards in Drancy were not Germans. There's an encounter between Rachel and a young French policeman in the first holding pen where the Jews have been taken. A grotesque situation. And this young, naive French policeman says to her, "Why are they doing this to you?" And she looks around and she said, "You mean the Germans? I don't see any Germans here." Right? Other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
What is the title of the book you wrote 20 years ago, the nonfiction book about anti-Semitism?
It's called Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, the History. And it would hold the door open.
Yes.
It's like that. It's a plow. But it was a plow to write. But one of the pivot points, there are a number of pivot points. There are great moments in this history where the story could have gone another way. And Abelard is one of them. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Could you comment on Pope Francis and where you see the current Pope in this continuum that you just brought, James?
Well, I think of Pope Francis as another one of those pivot points. It's a great gift to the Catholic Church. I also think to the West at this moment, to have this man in a position of leadership who's so clear about the moral crisis facing us, especially the vast inequality that is defining the problems, not just of the United States and the West and Europe, but of the globe. And if there's one thing Francis stands for, it is decrying the inequality of the world. And of course, the immediate emblem of that are the migrants who wash up on the shores of Europe. And he is their stoutest defender. He issued a decree 18 months ago to every Catholic parish in Europe, ordering them to take in a migrant family and provide housing and support for a migrant family. It was disobeyed. Imagine if Pope Pius XII had ordered every Catholic parish in Europe to take in a Jewish family in 1940. Having said that, I've written a lot about Pope Francis for the NewYorker.com, and I'm publishing a piece there tonight or tomorrow about his recent advancing toward the cause of sainthood, the Cardinal Primate of Poland during World War II, August Holland, who is being raised to sainthood in the Catholic Church. He is remembered in Poland as a stout opponent of the Nazis and then after the war of the Soviets. He died in 1948. He was a ferocious anti-Semite. He defended Jews against violent attacks, but in his same pronouncements about not attacking Jews, he promulgated the same old anti-Jewish slanders, calumnies, the Christ killers, the people who have turned against God, therefore God has turned against them. Christian theology of St. Bernard, the theology that took hold of the Christian imagination 1,000 years ago, he has been promulgating that. So I take Pope Francis to task. He's going to totally freak out when he reads this. I'm sure. Because it shows you what are we talking about? We're talking about human institutions and human beings. And even though Pope Francis made a huge advance of Jewish-Christian relations a year ago, when he said formally and officially, the first time, the Catholic Church renounces its ambition to convert the Jews. Converting the Jews has been job one of the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. And the impulse to convert the Jews has been at the bottom of all of this problem and hatred. Because it drives Catholics and Christians crazy that Jews, Jesus was a Jew, but the whole point of the story of Jesus is based on 1,000 years of Jewish expectation and belief about the Messiah. And Jesus fulfills all those expectations and belief, but the Jews say no to it? If Buddhists say no to it, no offense, Larry, if Buddhists say no to it, no problem. If atheists say no to it, no problem. If Jews say no to it, holy cow, maybe it's not true. We can't stand that possibility. That's what generates our insecurity/hatred of the Jews. Pope Francis renounced the Christian agenda of converting the Jews. The Jews don't need to be converted. The Jews don't need Jesus to be in touch with God. Wow. So Pope Francis is presiding over the largest changes in this theology in 1,000 years. And he's doing it unevenly. So he has a blind spot about the Cardinal Primate of Poland. After tomorrow, he won't have it anymore. Yes, sir.
Talk about the political situation in Poland, where it seems like the government is trying to whitewash the history of the Second World War by not allowing debate and criticism of the role that the Polish government and Polish people played in persecution of Jews.
Sure. This gentleman is referring to the 2018 law, so February of this year, passed by the Law and Justice Party government in Poland. The Law and Justice Party is an extreme nationalist, right-wing government in Poland that made it illegal to suggest that Poles or Poland were co-responsible or complicit in the Holocaust. Now, the background for this, of course, is that there's a broad misunderstanding of the complexity of the experience that the Polish nation underwent during World War II. Remember that 3 million Polish Jews were murdered. Of the 6 million Jews murdered, 3 million of them in Poland. But there were 3 million or so Polish Catholics murdered by the Nazis too. So that Poles think of themselves as a victim people. And they push back against the idea that the Jews are the victims. Especially when the complicity of many Poles is brought up. And when people talk about Auschwitz as the Polish concentration camp, they go completely nuts. So you're not allowed to say, it's against the law in Poland to call Auschwitz a Polish concentration camp. It isn't a Polish concentration camp, it never was. It was a German Nazi concentration camp in Poland. So that's the background to this law, but the law is a Holocaust distorting, terrible law that needs to be criticized, which is why this is not the time to move towards sainthood a cardinal primate of Poland who was himself complicit in the Holocaust, even though he opposed the Nazis. How was he complicit? By advancing the theology that made what the Nazis did possible. That's the complicity. It's not just the Polish Catholics, it's Catholic world, the Christian world in general. How it's not just, there were many thousands of perpetrators, but millions of people who were indifferent to what happened. And where did that indifference come from? Where did the perpetrating come from? It came from 1,800 years worth of demeaning, defaming, telling lies about the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is on the rise again in Poland. And it's no surprise. The comeback of fascism, and this is one of the things that Pope Francis has been most explicit about. He has compared the present moment in Europe to the early 1930s. It's important not to get hysterical about that, and not to somehow water down the historic character of the Nazi crime by comparing it readily to other moments. So we don't have Hitler in front of us, but nevertheless, it's important to remember. And the most important thing for people like me to remember is that we Christians were complicit and co-responsible for the Holocaust, and we have not in any way fully reckoned with that. And until we do reckon with it, and therefore change the theology that generated that complicity, we're still a danger to the Jews and to others. And the anti-Islamic, the ease with which we embraced a war against Islam is tied to this dynamic in our imaginations. Yes, sir.
I have a question about church politics. As I understand it, popes are selected by cardinals.
Yes.
As I understood the history of recent history, the other very conservative popes have packed the deck. So how Francis got through this whole thing. My question is whether or not Francis is similarly trying to change the deck.
So the question is about church politics. It's a good question. I'm no expert on it, but I'll tell you my impression. Francis, at this point, has appointed about 50 cardinals. And once you turn 80, you're not allowed to vote in the next election. So the cardinals, the very conservative cardinals who were appointed by Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul, are aging out. It's still hard to predict what would happen. Why did the cardinals choose this maverick figure, Francis? Well, the real radical choice wasn't theirs. It was the choice of Pope Benedict to resign. Popes don't resign. The press suggested, some pope had resigned in the Middle Ages. No, popes don't resign. The popes who didn't finish out their terms in the Middle Ages were driven out of town. In the tribal warfare of various clan families. Popes do not resign. When a pope resigned, that was the revolutionary moment. And so when the cardinals gathered in Sistine Chapel with Benedict having resigned, they're looking at each other and going like, what is this? They knew they had to do something. They could not just pick up one of the other guys in that mold. And Francis was already known as the Bishop of the Poor. And, of course, why did Benedict resign? He resigned because what the Holocaust had not done, alas, which has caused a major moral crisis in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has been deflecting it. What the Holocaust had not done, the pre-sex abuse scandal did big time. And now we know, of course, that some of the cardinals themselves were abusers. Cardinal Pell, reliably accused now, about to go under civil trial in Australia. Cardinal Pell, who was Pope Francis's man in charge of finance. So the collapse of moral authority of the Catholic Church, which is blatant and obvious to everybody, even to the cardinals, required a change. What happens next? Who knows? We have time for maybe one more, and then I'll be glad to chat informally afterwards. Anybody has the impulse? Yes, ma'am.
Could you just speak a little bit about your way of approaching your writing?
how I approach my
I
writing.
mean, how much time do you devote to it?
Yeah.
Do you have a certain time of day? Do you have certain ways? Those kind of things.
Thank you for that. It's a good question. You know, we all, I'm always anxious to know how writers live their work and life concretely.
Yeah.
I'm privileged to live with my life partner, my wife Lexa Marshall, who's also a writer, and we have a little cottage industry in our house. A little too little, wouldn't you say? So Lexa goes to her room and I go to my room. We've been fellow writers in the house for more than 40 years. It's a simple life, especially now that our children are gone. Although our daughter's back with her children. And you know why you don't kill your children, so that you can get your grandchildren. But no, I just go to my desk and hope something happens.
Do you have a special time of day? Do you work from one time to another?
Through the day, more or less. I wouldn't call it work. I mean, it's work. It's horrible, but it's a good day is when you forgot what time it is and
Yes.
you look up and the day is gone by.
Yeah.
But then you immediately panic and think, oh, geez, another one. Anyway, yes, Tricia,
Can I just quickly ask, what are you working on now?
what am I working on now? Well, I spent the last several weeks getting ready for this evening. And tomorrow I'll work on getting to the beach before the line gets too long. I'm not really working on anything. I just am so grateful to you all for coming out tonight. I, like Lexa, spend most of my life imagining readers, and publishing a book is a great privilege because you bring your secret life into the public, and if you're lucky, some people find a way to be kind to you. Not always the case, but you are very precious to me, more than you could imagine, to be able to be in the presence of readers, and to be in the presence of readers in a library, which is one of the great surviving institutions of our culture.
Yeah.
Imagine if we didn't have libraries. Would the Republicans vote to establish libraries? I just want